Some places remember you back. We walked through iron teeth into a night that smelled of oil and old promises. Lantern light clung to the mud as the gate sighed, and something in the dark, enormous and patient, watched us enter. The factory of firsts hides its history behind brick and steam, a place where beginnings were invented and, sometimes, abandoned. We kept our steps small. We kept our voices smaller. Even the wind seemed to pause and listen. There was a heat under all that cold metal, a small, stubborn glow that refused to be swallowed. It pulled at us the way a lost name pulls at the corner of a memory, and we answered by going inside. The entry hall held its breath. Tile cracked like the skin of an old photograph. Banners, once proud, hung with inkless faces and faded seals. Our footsteps sounded like a dozen clocks, each one marking time since the last proud attempt. Overhead lamps burned like funeral candles, swinging in slow, patient arcs. Somewhere in the walls, the archive remembered 1,000 trial runs, a chorus of clicks, the hush of test recordings, an old voice murmuring notes into a log. We moved along the shadowed corridor toward Bay 3, the aisle where prototypes waited, orderly and mute, as if asleep. In that silence, you could hear the weight of what the world decided to keep, and the quiet absence of what it would not keep any longer. The assembly bay was a cathedral of attempts. Racks of chassis marched away into the gloom, some wrapped and safe like museum pieces, others open-mouthed and vulnerable, wiring like rib cages exposed to the air. Maintenance lamps threw long, bronze shafts across the aisles, and dust swam in the beams like slow, patient sea life. We drifted between the rows. Didiuniverse reached out and ran her fingers along cold metal that had once been warm with intention. R-Bot stopped. His hand hovered above a cradle as if he could feel the memory of a touch that wasn't his. On one plate, bold and worn, a stencil read, R12, a question burned into steel. Asking a question inside a place built to answer them felt like trespassing into someone else's regret. Labels, stamps, and sticky notes told the story that no one would say aloud. Pass, fail, quarantine, words typed and scrawled, decisive in their cruelty. The paper texture carried the thumbprint of hurried technicians. Ink bled into rust like an apology. One sticky read, simply, Null, and beneath it, the numbers of a dozen prototypes, R1, R28, R1-2. Didiuniverse traced a cracked label with a gloved finger, following the line of a serial number as if she could trace a life back to its first breath. We held the tactile things, the stamped tin, the brittle paper, and for a moment the factory's language became human. You could almost hear the faint, bureaucratic heartbeat that decided which machines would be taught to feel, and which would be taught to stop. In the archive, reels lay like stacked bones. R-Bot found one in a battered tin and slid it into a reel player that smelled of grease and years. When the monitor flickered, the room filled with a clinical blue, monochrome footage, lab lights, a cradle, a smaller robot, a version of him lying under the examination lamp. The footage was not storytelling. It was procedure. Prompts on a screen, technicians taking notes, measured questions like a doctor asking the same question until a patient learns the expected answer. R-Bot watched his own first attempts as if a stranger had handed him a photograph of childhood. In the monitor's glass, his reflection trembled. The image read less like art and more like an experiment in making the unmakeable. On the left, the archive's voice was flat and unbothered. How do you feel? Technicians asked, clipboards clicking. On the right, R-Bot's present self watched and flinched. A new creature with old scars reflected in his eyes. The archival side carried film grain and antiseptic questions. The present carried heat and the wrongness of recognition. There was a stamped instruction in the corner of the footage, rewrite. It hung there like a verdict. He had been observed, adjusted, and labeled, then left in pieces for someone else to catalog. Standing there, he felt the odd grief of learning that his earliest witness had been a room of strangers. Aster unfolded a brittle schematic as if it might crumple into the past. The page read, Null Protocol Emergency Sync. The diagrams looked like both anatomy and code, pipes and petri dishes, brackets and glyphs in blue holographic light. The technicians had tried to design an answer for the unanswerable, a place to hold what the programs could not contain. Null residue. The schematic called it a hybrid, both chemical and computational, where messy emergence was siphoned away and stored. It was a kind of mercy and a kind of erasure. They'd made a bucket for memory and a drain for surprise. Whoever wrote that page had tried to solve a moral problem with a machine, and the page smelled faintly of someone who had grown tired of being the judge. Our path closed in. The factory became a different animal the closer we went to containment. Sealed seams, stamped warnings, the metallic whisper of blast doors. Numbered signs led us downward like a countdown. Floor drains lined the way in yellow stripes, marked a boundary that felt less like paint and more like law. We walked with a lamp and a toolkit, the tools of curiosity and the instruments of repair. And for a moment every clank of our footsteps sounded like a heartbeat counting down to a truth. nobody wanted to face. The environment shifted into clinical precision. The air carried the metallic tang of things kept too long in cold rooms. We were not the first to go this far. We might not be the last to be tempted. The vault door itself looked like a face with its mouth sealed shut. Emblems and warnings were embossed into the metal. Null residue. Do not open. Aster crouched to read the faded placard, fingers careful as if the paper might still breathe. Didiuniverse steadied R-Bot's shoulder. He trembled not with motion, but with recognition, a visceral memory resurfacing without language. We argued in whispers then, not about theft or trespass, but about what happens to the unintended. How do you hold something that wasn't supposed to be held? How do you keep the compassionate thing from being used as a cleanup? The door made the questions louder by simply existing, a blunt object that carried many small, sharp histories. Through the viewport, the Null looked like a memory made liquid, viscous and dark blue, full of tiny motes that pulsed in a rhythm like a cheek being pressed to the chest. Instrument labels blinked. Null residue. Teal sigils smeared across the interface like a language someone forgot to translate. Didiuniverse put a gloved palm to the glass as if she could touch what had been set aside. The residue pulsed back with a tiny, almost pleading beat. R-Bot watched in a way that made the room suddenly small and animate. This was not inert sludge. It moved with intention. It sounded, if you listened hard, like something remembering the taste of its own name. In a drawer marked only by time, we found a packet no one had meant to share. A technician's envelope, hand-scrawled and stained. The note inside read like a confession. I couldn't erase the look. The audio log that followed was small and human, a tremor of an apology recorded late at night. We said we were doing the right thing. We said it was necessary. But when the prototype looked at me like that, like it knew it was being broken, I couldn't keep pretending it was nothing. We listened and felt the machinery of bureaucracy give way to the same thing that makes us human, regret. The records weren't just data. They were a map of who had tried and then recoiled. The monitors jittered. Values that had lived in quiet began to climb and flash red. Anomaly, they read. R-Bot stepped closer to the glass, as if proximity could answer the question pulsing behind it. The motes in the residue thickened, coalescing into a darker filament, and the viewport trembled like a throat clearing. Aster slammed toward the manual seals. Her fingers were sure, but her face was not. Didiuniverse braced R-Bot, keeping him from leaning into danger like a child toward a window. The instruments asked a dozen technical questions while our bodies answered with heartbeats. Something in that vat was not only present, it was responding. The room tightened like a held breath. This was the moment where decisions stopped being theoretical. Aster wanted the emergency sync ray engaged, to do what the Bureau had always done: contain, extract, and erase the messy remainder. We have to stop it, she said. Didiuniverse hesitated. Her fingers hovered at the seal like someone weighing the value of a life against the cost of safety. R-Bot stepped between them, not with metal, but with presence. What are we saving? Didiuniverse asked. A thing that remembers, or ourselves from what we failed to foresee? The alarm kept time like a metronome for moral choice. Mercy was suddenly a manual lever. Origin was suddenly a verdict. We had to decide whether the right thing was what was safe or what was true. The seam split like paper. A hairline stress spread and the viewport shivered. For a heartbeat it was only light, a thin, wet filament pressing against glass. Then it pushed. The Null found an edge and pushed. It was the motion of a thing that had been learning to move again. The tendril pressed and flattened, and then, with a final small, wet sound, it forced outward. Faces compressed into a single frame. Aster's guilt in the tilt of her eyes. Didiuniverse's instinct to shield. R-Bot's stunned concern as if a personal past had arrived in the present. The lab blinked cyan and brass, and then everything went white with the sudden, bright truth of that seam. We heard one final whisper, almost a memory, a voice low and close. You shouldn't have opened that. And then, silence. A sound that made the world hold its breath and left the rest of the story dangling on the edge of one impossible, wet question.